Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to Cardinal Dash. I'm Daniel Martinez-Krams, joined as always by the one, the only King Jemison. So happy to have you all here today. And it is a fantastic evening if you're a Stanford fan. Stanford women's basketball with the incredible comeback and advancing to the Final Four. First off, we're going to start with our instant reactions on what was an incredible game for Stanford. King, I'm going to let you start us off.
Yeah, so I never in doubt, never in doubt, absolutely never in doubt. I never once feared that the number one team in women's basketball was going to have any issues getting by a really pesky Louisville team. I mean, it's not like there were any scary moments in that game. No, that was unbelievable. And full disclosure, I was actually doing a tutoring session, and the tutoring session ended at 7. And in the middle of that thing, I was kind of nervously checking the score, and I'm like, okay, what is happening right now? I mean, how do we have 15 points and there's like a few minutes left till halftime? And I'm like, okay, so it's just one of those days you're gonna have to win with your defense. And I was wrong. They did not have to win with their defense because the offensive explosion in the second half was unbelievable. To see what Ashton Prechtel and Kiana Williams combined were able to do, to see what this team was able to do from three in the second half was unbelievable. I I could not be more confident now in this team's ability to win a national championship. I actually think that having to come from behind in this way is the best thing that could have happened to them. Now they have seen the bottom of the barrel. They have seen they have felt what it feels like to play poorly in one of the biggest games of the season, and they have felt what it feels like to come back from that in the biggest way possible. And so, I mean, they're not going to hit shots like they did in the second half and everything forward, but I think they're going to carry that same confidence forward. And I also think that hopefully Cameron Brink is all good to go. I haven't heard the update there, but it's nice to know that even if she's not, Ashton Prechtel is ready to step in and really fill it up as well. And of course, Kiana Williams, we know she had a slow first half, but that's not the real Kiana. She's in a hometown revenge tour, and her homecoming could not have gone any better in that second half. So I think that this team is on to bigger and better things.
Cameron Brink will be okay, it sounds like. It sounds like she's just a little bit banged up. They were being cautious with her. And then also, hard to take out Ashton Prechtel after what she did. Absolutely just lit up the stat sheet. Finished with 16 points in 16 minutes, all coming in the second half. Stanford was plus 27 in her minutes. That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense. And after the game, Dana Evans, the Louisville guard, said, yeah, they brought in a 6'6 girl who went 3 for 3 from 3. And we were just like, I don't know what to do with that. Stanford just showed you that, hey, one player can go down, a Cameron Brink who was dominating in the first half, she had 5 blocks, and bring in someone completely different at center and say, you know what? This is going to be just fine. That's this Stanford team. They are just so deep. We've seen it all year long. And the metaphor that Tara Vanderveer really likes to use is one player is the conductor. Obviously, that's Kiana Williams for this team. And then every night, there's a different soloist. Today, Ashton Prechtel, Lexi Hull, both absolutely went off. Hull had 21 points. Not the most efficient, 6 of 14, but did get 8 of 9 at the line. Got 9 rebounds. Just scrapped for so many extra possessions. And then Kiana Williams really got it going for Stanford. As that run was starting in the second half, it was a Kiana Williams jumper that got it all going, which of course it was. This is Kiana Williams after all. And just so many different moments in that game. I think you have to credit Stanford's defense really coming to play in the second half. I think one of the most surprising things to come out of Tara Vanderveer's press conference was that she did lay into the team at halftime. This is a Tara Vanderveer, a head coach, a Hall of Fame head coach, who does not get into her players like that. But in this game, Tara Vanderveer was just saying, we need to do better. She was pointing out the stats to her players. She was saying, I didn't recognize who that was in the first half. She said that to her team. And that just makes so much sense. Stanford didn't play like Stanford in the first half. Stanford was shooting around 30% and allowing around 50%. That's just way off from where this team is all season. In the second half, it all came back into line, and you have to credit Kiana Williams for sticking with it. At the beginning, she was pressing. Just like at the beginning of the season, she was pressing. But she calmed down, found her way, and Stanford is moving on to the Final Four.
And there were a couple just deep pulls by Kiana that were just straight money. First of all, it felt like every three in the second half was falling, and the stats back that up. At one point, they, I believe, were 7 of 9 from three in the second half. So, I mean, it was just unbelievable the kind of production they were getting from beyond the arc. I mean, this is not a team that relies on the three. And yet in this game, they relied on the three to make a comeback. But there were a couple of shots in there that was just like, okay, late shot clock situation, nothing happening in this possession, nothing looks very good. And then you just have a logo shot from Kiana that's such a dagger in the heart of your opponent when they're already struggling to keep their heads above water in your comeback. So it just felt like one of those games in which this Stanford team realized how good they can be. And, you know, going to bring it back to Stanford women's volleyball a couple of years ago when they had a similarly dominant team, number one in the country throughout the season. And they face a really tough Elite Eight battle with Penn State, who's a traditional rival and the second best program in women's volleyball. Sure enough, they found themselves in a big deficit, but they just completely flipped it around late in the second set and dominated the rest of the match. Kind of similar. That's essentially halftime in volleyball. And they just went on to play fantastic volleyball in the Final Four and national championship and win it all, despite having that pressure of being the number one overall seed. I see a similar story about to unfold for Stanford women's basketball. Can't guarantee they're going to win. We know UConn's waiting on the other side. We know South Carolina is waiting for the card in the Final Four. But I think that they're going to gather way more confidence from this comeback win than they ever would have if they just kind of comfortably held Louisville at arm's length throughout the game.
And I just want to go back real quickly to what you said earlier about tutoring, checking nervously. One thing I know, just as a student journalist, we're supposed to be impartial. We try our best, I would say. I can tell you, in the first half, I had my projector out. I was watching in my dorm room. In the second half, change of scenery, dorm lounge. And I'm not saying it was me, but I'm also not saying it wasn't me. It just, one of those games where it just didn't make sense how much of a flip it was. They were just two completely different halves, and one half where it did look more like Stanford. And I love that analogy back to that Stanford versus Penn State in women's volleyball, because it's that kind of, one, dominance that you expect, but two, facing adversity. And that's going to be so important for Stanford as they move on, because only going to get tougher from here. Stanford has now won all of its games by double-digit points. A very incredible stat, very impressive. South Carolina is waiting on the other side, and they've done the exact same thing. Two just fantastic teams coming up, and that's why you love watching. And it's just been so much fun to have all of these games. We missed out on March Madness last year. That was atrocious, but getting it back this year and having it show up as it has is just truly incredible that we've gotten this quality of games with people who are dealing with just unimaginable circumstances. Stanford obviously had its 8 weeks, 10 weeks on the road that ESPN keeps hyping up with Holly Rowe's segment with the Stanford Nomads. But Stanford is now in the bubble in San Antonio going through much of the same things. I'm sure many people have heard about their ping pong tournament. That one is legendary. But just all of the different things they're doing to stay sane in what is a really insane environment. And no more than today, when in the press conference post-game, a fire drill sound is going off, as Ashton Prechtel is trying to talk to the media. She absolutely goes off and then has to go and sit through a fire hazard, and it turns out there's a fire at a concession stand. And she comes off the media early. Tara Vanderveer comes on, and she just stoic, looking at the media as they go to break. But if that's not this season in a nutshell, where just there's flames all around you. Stanford has dealt with so much this year, but to come away from this game with a win, as you've been saying, King, this is going to be so important for them. Just realizing, hey, we can come back from this. We can trust ourselves, and now we're advancing to the Final Four.
Well, speaking of moving on, want to give an update to the listeners who have chosen to watch the best show in sports television rather than a certain other March Madness game that was happening simultaneously. UCLA is moving on to secure that 3 of the 8 Final Four teams in college basketball are coming from the Pac-12. And if you throw it out to Gonzaga as well in men's basketball, that's 4 coming from the West Coast alone. And I think that goes to show that the Pac-12 was more prepared for the adversity that we're seeing in these bubble environments. Obviously, Stanford essentially lived in a bubble type environment for 10 weeks, as Holly Rose pointing out over and over again. And I think that like they should be applauded for just holding together through that in the first place. But now there's probably a small part of themselves that's thanking themselves for that experience, because they're now used to having to live out of a hotel room, of having to live in this completely controlled environment. And they're also used to just going about and doing their business on the court and realizing that, you know what, it's not looking the same as usual. Basketball is more of a job than it's ever been, but we're just going to go out there and keep dominating people. And so the Pac-12 has really showed out in both tournaments. Obviously, Arizona also in the Final Four. And I think that the Wildcats will certainly have a chance with Ari McDonald to upset the UConn Huskies. But I think what we're all expecting is a Stanford UConn final, and that would literally be the best possible thing for women's basketball. I think that would be the kind of event that you're going to see everybody tweeting about in the sports world. And I just do think that the way Stanford won this game, the heater they went on in the second half, particularly from beyond the arc, and the confidence that you see players like Lexi Hull and Ashton Prechtel gathering, obviously alongside their leader, Kiana Williams, is going to go a long way towards possibly breaking this 29-year title drought.
And as we look towards Stanford's potential to go about that final drought, is Stanford the favorite? It's been a really tough year for Stanford. They've been ranked number 1. They've also fell down in the rankings after those back-to-back losses to Colorado and UCLA. It's been a difficult year. Stanford is obviously playing incredible basketball right now, but at the same time, as you've been mentioning, there is a very, very good South Carolina team waiting. They've had a great tournament so far. Dawn Staley is the real deal as a head coach. Aaliyah Boston is just fantastic, and they have so many pieces around her. And then on the other side, you either get UConn, which of course is a team you're expecting to come out of that side because Paige Beckers is just wow. And then there's a team in Ari McDonald and Arizona that has really made a lot of moves this year, have really just trusted the process in that system. Adia Barnes has done some incredible things. So King, as you look towards this Final Four that will tip off on Friday, which I'm so lucky to be in attendance for, hopefully, what are you thinking? Is Stanford the favorite?
They've certainly played the best of the 4 favorites. I mean, if you look at the way they absolutely dominated Missouri State, we haven't even talked about that, but I mean, Stanford hit 15 threes in that game. I mean, they found the same heater in the second half against Louisville that they rode for the entire Missouri State. And shout out to Hannah Jump, who we haven't heard a ton from this season, but she went off in that game. And again, it's just great to get more and more of these players involved and confident in the tournament. But I think that it's hard not to see UConn sitting there, being the most storied program in women's basketball history and having the player who seems to be the best player in college basketball at this point, that it's hard not to see them as the favorite. That being said, there's a lot of controversy surrounding their Elite Eight victory over Baylor. Of course, former Stanford Cardinal Dejanay Carrington goes up for a shot very late in that game, very clearly fouled. LeBron thought it was a foul, so what else do you need to hear? But that was, I mean, if you just look at that shot, you know, obviously in real time, more of a bang-bang play. But if you look at the still photo, very clearly a foul. And you do have to blow your whistle in late games, even though referees sometimes don't want to insert themselves into those situations. So, I mean, they had to narrowly escape in that game. And they had to get a tremendous performance from Beckers just to get there. And so I think that Stanford can play with anybody. We know that. We know that they have even more depth than UConn. We know that on any given night, Kiana Williams can be a lot better than Beckers. It's just going to be a matter of who's making shots on that given night. And I do think that the struggle will be for Stanford to come down from the high of this tremendous Elite Eight victory where they had to come from behind and where they had to play so well in the second half, and now go and face a really strong South Carolina team when it feels like the next game should be the national championship, right? So that's going to be with just a few days to prepare. I mean, obviously, having this game on Friday is a much tighter turnaround than we usually see in the tournament. I think it's going to be critical that they refocus quickly. You know, Tara will have them doing that. You know, they've been used to that all season. The Pac-12 traditionally plays shorter turnarounds than other conferences. But still, I just think it's going to be interesting to see if Stanford comes out flat against South Carolina in the second half.
And I think it's worth looking at South Carolina as potentially the bigger hurdle to get over. And I say that because I'm more impressed with South Carolina's depth than I am of UConn's. I think tonight, Stanford showed that it could neutralize or just deal with having one player who is fantastic. And for Louisville, that's Dana Evans. She had a fantastic game. She scored 24 points. She was efficient. She had 9 of 20, but no one else was in double digits for the Cardinals. No one else. And Stanford will live with that all day long. If you look at a team like South Carolina, you have three players who average in double figures: Zaya Cook, Aaliyah Boston, Destiny Henderson. All three very, very talented and just an all around good roster with a fantastic big in Aaliyah Boston. And if you look at a team like UConn, you don't necessarily have that. You have a player in Olivia Nelson-Ododa who's had some great games and has had some games where she's completely disappeared. That's far different from a Stanford team who has a Cameron Brink or can pull up with a Ashton Prechtel or a Fran Belibi or sometimes a Haley Jones in the fives. There's all those different things. And then an Alyssa Jerome. Stanford just has that depth. And I think that's right now why I'm looking at them as a potential favorite. Of course, you can't discount Paige Beckers, who's just an absolute baller. Nothing short of that. She will give it to anyone on any day. But again, Stanford, used to the short turnaround, used to the bubble, have Tara Vanderveer as their coach. And obviously, at this point, all four head coaches are just absolutely incredible. But I would never put it past Tara Vanderveer, who has something on the line here. It's been 29 years. There is that drought. She wants this so bad. And she's in the press conference telling us that I didn't know if I was going to get back there. It didn't look so good. Earlier this year, she referenced the fact that John Arriaga had to keep her in coaching because she was back in like 2015 thinking, I don't know. I don't know if I can keep doing this. But she loves putting the puzzle pieces together. Today, the puzzle piece was inserting Ashton Prechtel in for the second half. Of course, now everyone's going to look back, and Tara Vanderveer knows this. She'll say, oh, I should have put her in the first half. But it's pushing the right buttons at the right times. It's knowing when you need to get up in your players' faces. It's knowing when you got to take the ping pong table away to make sure everyone's focused. It's that kind of coaching that is going to help Stanford so much. And then, of course, you have that senior leadership. You have Anna Wilson, who Dana Evans is going to go off. I think she could have had a better game if Hannah Wilson wasn't just in her face the entire game. Dana Evans made some incredible plays, and I expect Anna Wilson to be able to give it to any other guard she goes up against for the rest of this tournament.
That's a great point. I mean, South Carolina did just win 62-34 over Texas in the Elite Eight. A Texas team that had to upset UCLA, a team that I think all of us in Pac-12 country thought might even be better than Arizona on the other side, and certainly had moments. I mean, they beat Stanford, for crying out loud. So that was an impressive, resounding victory. And South Carolina suffered a few losses late in the season to Texas A&M, Tennessee, and UConn. Those are three really strong teams. But I think they found themselves again in the tournament. And as you said, a lot of depth, a lot of size. They're not a team that's going to really live and die by the three. They're going to live and die on the boards, and they're going to live and die defensively. And so Stanford's probably going to have to shoot over the top of a team like that. Obviously, they have the size to go inside, but you're probably going to need to hit shots in the same way that you did in the second half today against Louisville. And again, Anna Wilson, there's nothing you can do to somebody who's shooting like Evans was today, but she is going to be somebody who I think maybe a freshman like Beckers, she could get in her head and she could be all over her and maybe create some turnovers and really take Beckers out of her element. And then if that happens against UConn, there's really not much else that the Huskies have to offer, at least compared to a team like the Cardinal. So I think that it's a toss up. I think that there's three teams that could all be that I could all see raising the trophy on next Sunday night. But I will say Arizona is the one I don't see. I think that UConn probably is going to recover from a tough game against Baylor and handle their business there. And so I think that Stanford has got to first focus on a very different challenge of playing this defensive-minded South Carolina team. Then hopefully they'll have time to shift their focus to this UConn team that, I mean, has dominated women's college basketball for a long, long time under Gino. And so I think it would mean a lot, particularly for Tara to get that third title against somebody to whom usually the accolades in women's college basketball coaching go to, even though Tara, of course, is the GOAT and has the most wins.
If anyone can do it, it is Tara Vanderveer and this Stanford team. I think we're both just so excited for this next game. But I want to finish with talking about the men's tournament and specifically, King, I know you're a fantastic history major. I want to ask you about some revisionist history. If Stanford had been maybe given a little bit of credit for playing in the best conference in men's basketball, if they had somehow made the field, would Stanford have found a way to win a game in Indy?
It just seems like the Pac-12 is so charmed. I mean, Oregon State made the Elite Eight and was, just a handful of shots down the stretch from a Final Four appearance. It's clear that people slept on the Pac-12 all season. And get out of my face with this Big Ten crap. It shows that when you have a conference that gets so much hype, we completely lose perspective on the relative balance of power in the country. Because, for example, Ohio State lost 4 games at one point in a row this season and was still a 2 seed because we're like, oh, it's the Big Ten. Like, of course you're going to lose games, win a couple here and there and like you're good. Meanwhile, in the Pac-12, if you lose to like a really solid Utah or Washington State team, you're getting docked and they're saying, oh, like, Colorado can't possibly be any higher than a 5 seed because they lost to Washington. Or like Stanford has no shot because they lost to Washington State and Utah down the stretch. It's a totally unfair analysis of the different conferences. And again, in a year where we had very few non-conference games and so really didn't get to see these conferences compete against one another, we just didn't have the data to support the fact that the Pac-12 really was on the same level as these other conferences. And of course, like in the tournament, it's all about the bracket breaking your way. And for UCLA, like, yeah, they avoid Texas and instead get Abilene Christian in the second round. For Oregon State, they avoid Illinois and get Loyola Chicago in the Sweet 16. So, like, yes, the opportunities opened up for these Pac-12 teams, but they took advantage. And I do think that as we've seen in the women's tournament as well, these Pac-12 teams who had to live under greater restrictions, generally the Pac-12 footprint has been tighter against COVID. And so we are seeing more difficult they saw more difficult circumstances throughout the season. I think we're seeing that translate to more success in the bubble environments in the NCAA tournament. And I think again, like people were sleeping on the West Coast and they were overvaluing losses and undervaluing wins. And so sure enough, you find a bunch of underseeded Pac-12 teams, but the bracket broke their way and they took advantage. And I mean, it's March. So when a UCLA team gets hot like they have in the tournament, that 11 seed next to their name means nothing. I mean, what matters is the way they're playing right now. And I mean, I thought they would beat Michigan today. And sure enough, they come through beating a 2 and a 1 seed to reach the Final Four. And honestly, if any team can give Gonzaga a run for its money, it's a team like UCLA. It's just like, I mean, we don't care about getting easy shots. All we do is take contested twos anyway.
And that's so true. And I think a lot of it goes back to how the Pac-12 was undervalued, underranked all season long. You joked earlier about including Gonzaga in the West Coast as the 4 of the 8 teams that are making the Final Four across men's and women's. But if if the Pac-12 did something like that, bringing in a Gonzaga just for basketball, that's the kind of big moves that you could think about with a successor in the Pac-12 commissioners. It's just big moves that could help the Pac-12 look better on the biggest stage to have that media coverage, to not have this East Coast bias that we're all so used to. So I think this really segues into the comment that Peter Goffin left for us. Thank you so much for watching, Peter. And again, anyone, if you have something to say, leave it in the chat. He asked if the Pac-12 plays the Big Ten all the way down, number 1 versus number 1, number 2 versus number 2, how many do they win? And I think if we're just looking at it right now, you think the Pac-12 might come out on top in a fair number of those. What are you thinking, King?
Yeah, I mean, I want to pull up some Big Ten standings. We're gonna say Stanford, they get the like what 5 seed in the conference tournament. They're really like number 6 because UCLA wasn't eligible. That would mean that if they were playing in a Big Ten Pac-12 challenge set up exactly to Peter's liking, then they would be playing Rutgers. And I'm not going to lie. Yes, Rutgers gave Final Four team Houston a run for its money. Stanford absolutely would be right there with that team. And I think that Stanford, talent-wise, is at least as good as UCLA. Far better than Oregon State. Obviously, they beat UCLA, and that meant that I think over the course of the Sweet 16, UCLA or Stanford had beaten 3 Sweet 16 teams and a couple Elite Eight teams with wins over Oregon State and UCLA. So Stanford proved they can play with teams that are now among the tops in the sport. And I mean, if you look at just the talent on the roster, Oscar da Silva being an All-American caliber player, Zaire Williams at his best being an All-American caliber player, having just this elite defensive unit that can lock up opposing wings. At his best, absolutely, Stanford could win a game in Indy, and probably two. I definitely thought that if they could just get some momentum down the stretch, this was a dangerous team because their record did not reflect how good they could be. And then again, Peter's question is fantastic. I think if you look at the way this tournament is going, over across those 12 games, I would expect the Pac-12 would go something like 7-5, 8-4, because I do think that what we've always praised the Pac-12 for is parity, and what they've proven in this tournament is that they also have that elite play at the top that people have always been saying the Pac-12 never gets.
Cal's probably not doing too well in that, even against Nebraska. Cal just struggled this year. That's a fact. But you look at a team like Washington State, which finished 11th and 10th, going up against Minnesota or Northwestern, and you're saying the Pac-12 could make some noise. And that's what we've really been saying all year long and for many years now, that Pac-12 basketball deserves its due. It's a tough conference. There's some great teams. I think Stanford is one where we have to keep talking about it because we've been talking about it, that they've had their ups, they've had their downs. There's times where Oscar da Silva looked like the best player on the planet, and we're thinking, hey, this guy deserves the Pac-12 Player of the Year over Evan Mobley, which sounds crazy right now considering all we've seen from Evan Mobley in this tournament. But there was a while where Oscar da Silva's resume looked better than Evan Mobley's, and obviously Oscar da Silva hurt at the end of the year, and I think that ended his chances. But that is an incredibly talented player paired with a likely lottery pick. All of this is working in Stanford's favor. Would they have won a game in Indy? I don't know. Obviously, it's going to depend on the matchups that they would have been given in this hypothetical scenario. But they played with Oregon down the stretch without Oscar da Silva. They also lost 5 straight games to end their season. So we've seen so many different Stanford teams. What they would have done is nearly impossible to predict. But I really appreciate this question from Peter because it's fun to think about. What would Stanford do if it was given a full non-conference schedule this year? If it was given its due, if it was allowed to play these different teams?
And that's a great point about the non-conference schedule because Stanford was 10-10 in the Pac-12. That was, I believe, they were 9-9 last year, and still probably on the right side of the bubble come Selection Sunday before COVID wiped that out. If Stanford had not played such a limited non-conference schedule and only gotten 3 games against those quote-unquote like guarantee games, they played the Cal State Northridge, Cal State Bakersfield, and North Carolina AT&T. No, North Carolina A&T. One. I've been listening to too much March Madness Live and all those very annoying AT&T commercials. But yeah, then played North Carolina A&T. That was actually a road game for the Cardinals, so shouts to them for playing a road game against a mid-major. But anyway, like they could have accumulated wins over weak non-conference competition, and then that 10-10 Pac-12 record doesn't look so bad. And so it was also one of those years where the Pac-12 playing fewer non-conference games than other conferences in many cases also prevented a team like Stanford, maybe a team like Utah or Washington State from having any shot at an NCAA tournament berth. Because in a vacuum, 10-10 in the conference should not disqualify you from a chance at going to the NCAA tournament. And if you look back to February 18th when Stanford dominated Washington on the road and won that game by 18, had the Bryce Wills dunk. I mean, that was the high point. That was the high point of Stanford men's basketball. And at that point, there was no doubt they were in the tournament. Like they might have even been a single-digit seed. And they were 14-8, 10-6 in conference. And then they just lost 5 straight at the end of the season. And that's why we're playing this what if, folks. It's because we saw what Stanford could be. And that's why we're frustrated with the way this season played out, because they put themselves in a position for the vast majority of the season to go to the tournament. They survived the COVID pause. They survived having to go on the road for 59 out of 64 days. They survived not having those guaranteed games in the non-conference. And then they go at the end of the season and just let it all go and drop the ball. And obviously, when you compare it to what Stanford women's basketball is doing and peaking at the right time, we've talked about this multiple times, that's what makes it extra frustrating. So that's what Jared has to figure out next year and for the rest of his Stanford career, which we hope is very long. You got to find a way to peak in March, because that is what separates the great college basketball coaches from the average.
And just one last note on this conference scheduling thing. I think both men's and women's Pac-12 basketball coaches would tell you, iron sharpens iron. We are so happy to be playing all of these in-conference games. That helped us. If you look at the women's side, you're seeing all these teams in the Final Four, in the Sweet 16, in the Elite Eight. Same thing on the men's side with just domination to a certain extent in the tournament. Playing all those games in the conference absolutely helped, as opposed to, if you look at the women's side, a UConn, which does not get tough competition in the Big East. Obviously, UConn throughout history has been able to go through with that lighter schedule and do fine in March, but I think Stanford and the Pac-12's model of scheduling tough games helps in the long run. Thank you all so much for listening to this wonderful episode of Cardinal Dash. Thank you, as always, King, for joining me. Follow us at Dash Sports TV, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. We'll be back next week after Stanford women's basketball season has concluded, whether it's with a national title. That's the see. See you all next time.